Today we're going to learn about bivariate data and trend lines. When we look at scatter plots, they're always going to model a linear, nonlinear, or no association, and we're going to use this to estimate a trend line and use our trend line to make some predictions. What is bivariate data? Bi just means two, and bivariate data just means that we're looking at two variables, x and our y. Bivariate data deals with cause or relationships. The major purpose of bivariate data is to analyze or synthesize information and make guesses or assumptions about it. We're going to explore bivariate data using scatter plots. A sample question might be, what type of relationship exists between the number of hours a student studies and their score on the math test? Hours would be our x, and the score on their math test would be their y, because the number of hours tells us what they might score on their math test. If bivariate data has a linear relationship, we identify the trend of the data. So let's look at these two graphs here. You'll notice that one has a positive trend because the line is going up, and the second one has a negative trend because the line is going down. These are both examples of linear relationships because the dots are moving in a linear pattern. What does nonlinear pattern look like? It's data that has a trend but is not linear. So basically what that means is you can see that it creates a line, but it's not a straight line. Therefore, it's called nonlinear. This can not be considered positive or negative because they're not linear. So you can notice that A looks like it's trending upwards, but it's actually still just nonlinear. There's no such thing as nonlinear positive or nonlinear negative. They would just be classified as nonlinear. The last example is no relationship at all. When the data has no trend or relationship, it is classified as no relationship. If you look at these dots here, you'll notice that there's no pattern to these dots, which means that there is no relationship or no association. Next, we're going to look at what we call trend lines. The trend line, or line of best fit, is a line that represents the trend correlation between two variables on a scatter plot. You'll notice that these dots have a trend that looks linear, and so what we did is we drew a line through the middle of those dots. A trend line does reflect the general relationship between variables in a data set, and it helps us to make reasonable predictions about what might happen. But it does not necessarily include or connect every point in the data set, and it doesn't show us exactly what will happen, because as we know, in real life, data is not going to be perfect. Let's look at how we can use a trend line to make some predictions. By looking at the trend line, we can predict that a baby that is 27 inches long is likely to weigh 15 pounds. Now, that's kind of an interesting prediction. Let's see where we came up with this. You'll notice that if I looked on the trend line where it says 27 inches long, you'll see the 27 right here. And if I go straight up until I run into my trend line here, and then I move over to my y-axis, there's the number 15. So if I had to make a prediction about a baby's weight, I would just try and find the height here and then draw my line up into the trend line like so, and it would tell me the weight or predicted weight. Now you'll notice that this trend line here doesn't intersect any of the dots, but it does have the same amount of dots on each side. You'll notice that we have 4 dots on top and 4 dots on the bottom. Let's look at another example. So how do I draw a trend line? You draw a trend line that follows the trend of the data series, and remember the trend line should have about as many points above the line as it does below the line. By looking at the trend line, you'll notice that what we see is that this trend line does not go through the origin necessarily. A lot of students think that the trend line must always go through the origin, or it must go through multiple dots. This trend line does go through multiple dots, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Now that we've drawn the trend line, we would make a prediction about the data. This says, by looking at the trend line, predict how many hours of sleep someone would get who watched 5 hours of TV. Now, I would look for the number 5 on the graph next to hours, And you'll notice that we see hours here on the x-axis. So then we would draw our line up until we hit the trend line. And you'll notice we hit here. And then we would go over to the left, and it would tell us that we would get about 4 hours of sleep. Now we're going to draw a trend line that follows the trend of this data series. And remember, again, that the line must have as many dots on the top as well as the bottom. So to draw an effective trend line, there's a couple different strategies that you can use. A lot of times I recommend using a straight edge or a ruler, so that way you can see that the dots are separated evenly. Now, what I recommend as well to make sure your trend line is as close to the data as possible is drawing a box around the data. I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to draw a line this direction as well as this direction here. I kind of box my data, and what that allows me to do is make sure that my trend line kind of goes between the middle of those data points. So this probably isn't going to be perfect, but I'm going to try my best to split the points perfectly and draw a straight line through them. Notice my trend line isn't perfectly straight. It doesn't necessarily have to be. The main goal, again, is that we're splitting the data right down the middle. And you'll notice that I went through a couple dots, and I have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dots on top, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dots on bottom. So it's pretty close. Now that I've drawn my trend line, I'm going to make a prediction. And it says to predict the value of a car that was purchased 10 years ago. So I'll notice that the bottom says years and the other side says car value. So I'm going to start with the years, go over to 10, and I'll draw a line up to my trend line, which is about right here. And I would go over to the left side, and it's right between 20 and 18. So it's probably going to be about $19,000. Things to remember. A trend line always follows the trend of the data and is used to show the relationship between two variables. The trend line may or may not pass through one or more points on the scatter plot, as mentioned. Trend lines do not always begin at or pass through the origin. Also, making predictions means you will need to go beyond the data, and it is always going to be an estimation, not a guaranteed answer. I hope this helped with trend lines. The best way to really get good at trend lines is to practice. So I highly recommend that if you're still confused about this video, to do some practice and really just practice drawing trend lines using the box and the line through the method. If you have any questions, again, you can always rewind the video or get some additional practice.